launched before the adoption 2 years ago of a historic resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. This series of dialogues making links with ongoing multilateral processes to tackle plastic pollution in Geneva and beyond is organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs, the University of Geneva, and the governments of Norway and of Switzerland. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop the international legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution is meeting for its 5th session at the end of next month in Busan, in the Republic of Korea. The Road to Busan event series, organized as part of the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues in collaboration with various partners, provides member states and stakeholders a platform to prepare for the upcoming negotiation. By launching new reports and initiatives and hosting briefings and discussions such as the one you are attending today for a timely outcome of this very important negotiation. Today's dialogue will discuss how prioritizing principles of accountability, transparency, and justice are essential to enable the future global plastics treaty to succeed in its objective to end plastic pollution. Before we begin, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made as usual available on the webpage of this event. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box, and those will be used to feed the discussion during the Q&A session. You have on the slide, you can see how to access this Q&A box. I would also like to add that the transcript is also available in 100 languages, as indicated in this new slide. And now, to formally welcome you and introduce you to the topic of our discussion, I'm delighted to give the floor to our moderator, Laurent Hubert, who is the Executive Director of Action on Smoking and Health. Laurent, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Diana. Excellencies, colleagues, welcome and thank you for joining this webinar on prioritizing principles of accountability, transparency, and justice in the future Global Plastic Treaty. Organized within the framework of the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogue, Road to Busan's event series, and co-sponsored by the Center for International Environmental Law, the University of Edinburgh, the Global Center for Good Governance and Tobacco Control, Action on Smoking and Health, the Geneva Environmental Network, and the Geneva Beat Plastic Dialogues. I really want to thank you all for joining us today because we're addressing a very critical set of topics. And because the extent to which the Plastic Treaty is able to succeed in its objective to end plastic pollution really depends on its ability to prioritize principles of accountability, transparency, justice, and also, given the very powerful economic interests around plastic, its ability to address conflict of interest, particularly commercial interests that may not align with the aims of the treaty. So far, while the draft text of the internationally legally binding instrument does emphasize the need for equitable and inclusive distribution of costs and responsibilities in tackling the plastic crisis, so far it lacks sufficient attention to procedures to ensure the meaningful participation of the constituencies that are the most affected by plastic pollution, and also lacks safeguards against undue economic and political influence from those who benefit from plastic. An issue that has somehow been raised time and again since the INC1, the first round of negotiations, but not adequately addressed. However, we have an opportunity, given that the negotiations of the Plastic Treaty are to conclude at INC5 this year in November, there's an opportunity for those principles to be included in the instrument. So today you will hear 2 short presentations followed by a panel discussion. And those presentation and panel discussions will address the difference between the various non-state actors in the Plastic Treaty negotiation process. That includes civil society, academia, media, corporations, and some corporations that may have vested commercial interests. And the panel will propose ways to facilitate the engagement of affected constituencies in the decision-making process, present solutions and mechanisms to avoid the undue influence of vested corporate interests, basically how we can protect the treaty against the commercial conflict of interest, and share lessons from other multilateral agreements and relevant UN bodies, like, for example, the Aarhus and Esquazú agreements, which do include measures to address transparency, participation, and access to information, and the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which includes conflict of interest measures for the corporations, in that case, that were responsible for the product that the treaty was meant to address. So those are good precedents that could be useful for the U.S. Plastic Treaty. So without any further ado, I will introduce the first speaker, Grant Ennis, who's a lecturer at the Monash University and author of Dark PR, How Corporate Disinformation Harms and Undermines Our Health and the Environment. And he will address industry influences in public policy and the corporate capture playbook. And Grant, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Laura. I'm very, very honored to be here today. Let me share my screen. Great. So I have a very brief time slot today, so I'll go a little bit quickly. Really great to be here with all of you. The bulk of what I'll be saying here today is based on my book, Dark PR, which covers the cross-industry playbook, which I've adapted today for plastics. In my book, I cover diabetes, global warming, and road death, as well as tobacco. So I want to just start by saying we often think we need to make things better. But I think we first need to recognize that the system isn't really broken. It's this way by design. The problems we're facing with plastic are by design. People are profiting off of the governments subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. So we have policies in place that are getting the fossil fuel industry very wealthy to all of our harm, to all of our ill health and all of the other kinds of problems that are resulting from fossil fuel subsidies and fossil fuels and the resulting product of plastics. That was a short video just to say that we really need to organize and be fighting back against these kinds of things. And there are people that are doing it. One of the things that gets in our way, though, unfortunately, is that we have a lot of unfortunately mistaken beliefs. And that we have to kind of ratchet back. We need to unlearn some things, partially because we've been financed by the fossil fuel and plastics industry for so long. Our universities are awash with fossil fuel funding around the world. Researchers that are working on these kinds of issues are being funded by the industries that are creating the problem. This is a very serious issue. So many of the things that we believe to be true are based on research financed or influenced by the industries causing the harm. The same goes for our NGOs and charitable organizations, unfortunately. For a very long time, the environmental sector has been largely financed, not wholly financed, but has taken a lot of money, I should say, from fossil fuels. And this is, again, has influenced what we believe is necessary to do. It's influenced our levels of political will for action. And it means that we really need to unlearn a lot of things. Another element here is the way that public policy has limited what charitable organizations around the world can say and do. So the democratic right of association, of assembly, is quite at risk by a lot of the laws that we have in place around the world that make it, if not de jure, at least de facto illegal to demand government action as a charitable organization. So anything that limits what a civil society organization can do or say has eventually a chilling effect to make it so that people say a whole lot less. We demand less policy action. We channel our efforts into less effective interventions as a result of this. So we have some very serious issues related to the financing and regulation around civil society and research that have led us to a lot of beliefs that are really just not true. So this is where I say we really do need to kind of throw off these kinds of this information that we have that is inaccurate. We need to kind of like unlearn a lot of this stuff. We need to organize and really focus on demanding change to get the change we want to see. And part of that is realizing there's this cross-industry playbook. The industry, according to my research, uses a combination of framing techniques of 9 frames that are kind of meta frames that are the same across any industry and issue. So here you can see a diagram on the right where I've got diabetes, global warming, and road death. I've prepared today the framing typology for plastics, and I'm going to go through it very quickly because we don't have a lot of time. So the first is denialism. We all know about denialism, from fossil fuel denialism, global warming denialism, but it's also the same for plastics. But then after denialism, it really starts to get more and more sophisticated. So the next frame is called post-denialism, and I'm going to play a brief clip.
Presenting the possibilities of plastics. Plastics help save you from dents and broken bones. It helped protect my patella. They help save energy.
Thin light plastics, fewer trucks, less gas.
They help save you from being scrambled. They help save the soda. They help food stay fresher.
Brussels sprouts?
Plastics can even help save toddlers from trouble.
And this vest helps save my dad's life.
Plastics make it possible.
So that was the American Plastics Council using the post-denialist frame to say how plastics are good. There's more modern videos, but all of the ones that I have are a little bit longer and weren't really appropriate for today, but they're equally or even more so disturbing. This content is just getting better and better with the years. They're not changing the playbook, but they're hiring better actors and paying more for production. The next is the normalization frame. So you'll have industry saying things are normal or natural to kind of downplay any kind of anger we might have. So here you have natural plastics. Plastics are made from natural ingredients, such as crude oil. It's ridiculous. Now, the next frames are all in some way or another solution frames. So I just wanted to underscore that people think sometimes that we can promote two frames at once, but that's not the case. Political will is zero sum. I mean, when you have an election, one person wins. And the same goes for policy. So if you are promoting false solutions, you're reducing support for policies, effective policy. The first is recycling. I'm going to use recycling a couple of times, but there's one element of recycling that's key. This idea that you can create a wasteful product and then reuse it somehow without loss. I call this a silver boomerang frame. You see it in other industries as well. With tobacco, it's the cigarette filter, where the industry said you can add a filter to a cigarette and then it will be healthy. But what researchers have found is people inhale more profoundly with a cigarette filter and they get just as many chemicals in their system. This silver boomerang frame is the same with recycling. There's no way to continue to reuse recycling at the scale that we need in a way that wouldn't have a net loss, have a net level of toxin in our system. The next is magic. So this could be like genetic solutions for diabetes or obesity, or autonomous cars for road death, or carbon capture storage for global warming. In the case of plastics, I really think it's biodegradable plastics. It's a pretty ridiculous idea. But here you have Plastics Europe promoting it. Lots of plastics industry associations promote this kind of thing. The next frame is the treatment frame. This is like adapting to global warming rather than preventing it. It's ambulances to solve road death rather than preventing the crashes to begin with. Industry likes to promote the treatment frame. And it's not that we don't need to treat ill health, but when you promote treatment over prevention, of course, you get less prevention. And if you're an industry that would lose money from prevention, you're going to want to push back against that. So Keep America Beautiful is a front organization for the plastics lobby that was created, I believe, in the 1950s. And one of the first activities that they created was trash pickups. I think you have a similar one in the UK called Keep Britain Tidy or something to that effect. You have these kinds of organizations all around the world. There's been a lot written about it. It's quite disturbing. So people that would be organizing and protesting and trying to demand change instead go on the weekends and pick up trash and don't act politically. Next is victim blaming. Sometimes I'll call this individualism, which is perhaps a better frame. The industry in the 1950s started to try and shift the blame for pollution onto the individual by blaming people for littering. And there's a very famous clip to this effect called the Crying Indian ad, which I'm going to play right now.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
So that advert won a number of awards. It won the Clio Awards. It's worth noting that this actor was posing as a Native American for a number of years, but he was actually Italian. He went by Iron Eyes Cody, but his name was Espera Oscar de Corti. Everything about that video is fake news. It was funded by the plastics lobby. And this kind of littering thing eventually became recycling, and recycling and this kind of focus on the individual has done a really great job of making sure we keep the focus on not the policy structures, not policies, not banning plastics, but instead keeping individuals blaming themselves. We found when you expose people to these messages, act as an individual, act as an individual, act as an individual, people become less likely to support policy interventions. And neither can you do both. If you say act as an individual, recycle, don't litter, and vote for policy, you would get less policy support than if you had only been using a policy message. So it's been a really ingenious tactic by industry to keep the focus on the individual. I love this tweet very much because people just don't believe what I just said. Unfortunately, the research is really solid on it. You can email me and get more details, or I can send you. You can read my book if you'd like and the sources that I cite, or we can set up a call sometime if you'd like more information. But I love this quote that says, "I still think my favorite thing that's ever happened to me on the internet is the time a guy said, 'People change their minds when you show them facts.' And I said, 'Actually, studies show that's not true,' and linked 2 sources. And he said, 'Yeah, well, I still think it's true,' or still think it works." The fact of the matter is, for carbon labels, plastic pollution labels, or whatever you would have, or campaigns to get people to litter less or recycle more, or education programs to get people to act as an individual, they do not change population behavior. We need policy solutions, and there's no place in solving these kinds of issues for these kinds of individualized, focused narratives. That doesn't mean we can't use labels, media, and education, but they need to be focused on the population level problem, the global problem, or on policy change. The next is the knotted web frame that usually comes in the form of complexity or circular or systemic. We know that when you tell people it's complex or it's circular, it's systemic, it's a web, they become less likely to support policy, change. In the case of plastics, here's one example. You have the circular economy has been widely used by industry to undermine policy action and root cause solutions. So we need to be very wary for these kinds of terms. It's complex, it's systemic, it's circular. Words like root cause and structural are probably a better fit for people that are well-intentioned and looking for a similar kind of terminology. And finally, you have multifactorial. This is the last of the 9 devious frames, as I call them. And this is where industry will say we need a combination of solutions, or the problem has a number of causes. This goes back to the tobacco industry. This is the Roper proposal from the 70s. This is one of the leaked documents that was given to University of California, San Francisco researchers in the 90s. And to summarize, it's basically the tobacco industry saying, no one's going to continue to believe us when we say that tobacco isn't causing cancer. So we need to start saying lung disease is multifactorial. We need to say it's caused by lots of things, and it needs a combined solution. Multifactorialism is not an axiomatic truth. It could be the case in a given situation, but at the moment, and I think at least partially as a result of the tobacco and other industries contributing to this narrative, people think it's just always true that everything is multifactorial, and that's actually, 1, not ideologically correct by any means, and 2, is something that's been widely weaponized by industry to undermine really important policy action. So here you can see reduce, reuse, recycle. We need a combination of approaches. This is a chemical company saying this. You also rarely do you see reduce, reuse, recycle, and banned plastics. But if you were to see and banned plastics, you would still be diluting political will for action by mixing the things that do work with the things that don't. And I'll be concluding there. We need to be organizing as we are here today on this call and demanding political action as we are doing today on this call. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Please stay in touch. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Grant, for this presentation, which, having worked in tobacco control, but definitely for many years, we've seen the tobacco industry behave very much that way. Our next speaker is Anastasia Giardrossi, who's an associate legal officer at the Aarhus Convention Secretariat. And she will show and present some lessons from the Aarhus Convention procedural rights, which could be applicable to the plastic treaty and could be good examples to address transparency, access to information, and so on and so forth. Anastasia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just waiting for the presentation to be on screen. Thank you. So I would like to first thank about the organizers for the invitation to present at this very timely event, the Aarhus Convention and its relevance for promoting transparency, accountability, and justice in the future Global Plastics Treaty. Next slide. So for those who are not familiar with the Aarhus Convention, its full name is the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters. It is a legally binding instrument that was adopted in 1998 in the city of Aarhus, Denmark, and it entered into force in 2001. And at present, there are 47 parties, which include 46 states from Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the European Union. And it is an international, globally binding instrument, which is open to accession to any member state of the United Nations. And the origin of the Aarhus Convention may be traced back to the 1992 Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, and in particular, its Principle 10, which affirmed the importance of ensuring that every person has access to information, can participate in decision-making processes, and can have access to justice in environmental matters. And the Aarhus Convention very much builds on this principle to establish a set of obligations around three main pillars. The first pillar on access to environmental information, the second pillar on public participation in decision-making, and the third pillar on access to justice in environmental matters. And the convention also has a protocol, the protocol on pollutant release and transfer registers, which is an independent instrument, but at the same time reinforces the first pillar of the Convention on Access to Environmental Information. And it is also important to mention it in the context of promoting transparency and accountability, because it requires parties to create and to establish registers of pollutants that are released into the environment and that are transferred off-site for treatment or disposal. And this really helps the public to understand what pollutants are in a certain area, and this includes also pollutants related to plastics. Next slide, please. And while the convention provisions mainly deal with the implementation of the right of access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice at the national level, there is one provision which is very relevant for today's discussion that deals with the application of the rights of these rights at the international level, including in the context of the Global Plastics Treaty. And this is Article 3, Paragraph 7 of the Convention, which calls on parties to the Convention to take proactive action towards guaranteeing public participation in all international forums related to the environment in which they participate, and this includes also in the negotiations of a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. And in order to implement this provision, the meeting of the parties of the Convention, which is the overarching governing body of the Convention, has adopted in 2005 the Almaty guidelines on promoting the application of the principles of the Aarhus Convention in international forums. And these guidelines provide guidance on how to apply Article 3, Paragraph 7, both with respect to the rules and practices of international forums, but also with respect to the substantive outputs of these forums. Next slide, please. I will now focus on the content of the Almaty guidelines and in particular on some of its key paragraphs, which are very relevant for today's discussion. And one of them is paragraph 15 of the Almaty guidelines, which calls for specific measures or special measures to be taken to ensure a balanced and equitable process for members of the public which have differentiated capacity, resources, social cultural circumstances, or economic or political influence. And the guidelines also advocate for the need to design mechanisms and processes within these international forums that promote transparency, that minimize inequalities, and most importantly, for the topic of conflict of interest, avoid the exercise of undue undue economic and political influence. And I would also like to finally stress the importance of supporting the participation of those constituencies that are not directly affected, that are mostly directly affected by the matters that are discussed in the international forums, but they do not have the means for participating. And regarding access to information, the guidelines provide that to make access to the public more consistent and reliable, the parties should encourage international forums to have clear and transparent policies and procedures on how to gain access to environmental information they hold, and that they also should ensure that all the relevant documents contained in the which are being discussed are also made promptly available on in a timely manner on the internet or other instruments. And additionally, the Almaty guidelines also provide guidance on how to promote public participation in the context of an international forum. And this includes stating that the right to public participation should be extended to all the meetings of these forums, including those of the subsidiary bodies and groups at all the stages of the decision-making process. And this includes, for example, granting observer status to members of the public, opening advisory committees, forums, and dialogues to members of the public, arranging for webcasting of events, and also inviting comments from the public on draft documents or other substantive outcomes of the international forums. And if there are any accreditation or selection procedures that are applied, the guidelines emphasize that these procedures should be clear and transparent and as simple as possible. But being granted admission to the meeting rooms is not sufficient to effective and meaningful public participation. It is also important to ensure that the stakeholders have the right to circulate written statements, speak at the meetings, and intervene during these sessions. And also, finally, on the pillar of access to information, the guidelines state that international forums should have a review procedure to ensure the enforcement of the rules and practices that are related to access to information and public participation for that particular forum. Next slide, please. And finally, I would like to conclude. Next slide, please. Thanks. That UNEA Resolution 5/14 has explicitly mandated for the development of an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution that takes into account the principles of the Rio Declaration, in particular also Principle 10, and calls for the widest and most effective participation possible. And the Aarhus Convention, including the Almaty guidelines, provide a model for good practices on how to ensure inclusive participation, accountability, and justice, both in the negotiation and in the implementation of the treaty. And the working group of the parties, which is the highest intersessional body of the convention in 2002 and 2003, has recognized the importance of promoting the principles of the convention also in the processes related to the legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. And in 2023, it has urged parties to increase their efforts to avoid the exercise of undue economic and political influence, with specific regards to the negotiations on plastic treaty. And finally, I would like to end recalling that not only the parties to the Aarhus Convention, but also the parties to the Escazú Agreement in the Latin American and Caribbean context have an obligation to undertake efforts to promote public participation in international forums. And this is because the Escazú Agreement has a very similar provision on binding on its parties to promote public participation in international forums. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, for providing an example that could be really applicable to the plastic treaty in the area of ensuring inclusive participation, while at the same time also addressing undue influence, corporate influence. Now we will go straight to a panel discussion where we will have 6 panelists. We'll start with a 5-minute introduction. One of the panelists will use slides, and then there will be time for Q&A with the audience. So I encourage actually the audience, if you wish to, you can already start asking and sending questions via the Q&A bubble in the or the tool in the WebEx software. So I will start with the first panelist, who's Rob Ralston, who's a lecturer in public policy at the University of Edinburgh, and has a tremendous amount of expertise in the area of corporations and corporate conflict of interest. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurent. In my contribution, I'd like to build on points made by the previous presenters, and I'll outline the risk of the Plastics Treaty being captured by corporate interests and why an accountable and legitimate agreement must ensure the meaningful participation of those directly affected by environmental injustice. My research examines the political economy of plastics, and I have previously worked on the corporate political strategies of the tobacco industry. While there are encouraging signs that certain companies are leveraging their influence to push for a significant reduction in fossil fuel-based plastics, there remains widespread concerns within civil society around corporate influence over negotiations, and also conflicting interests with the objectives of a global plastics treaty to address the full life cycle of plastics. While good governance is often seen as synonymous with the opening up of decision-making to all affected actors, in issues where there exist powerful economic interests, safeguards are needed to prevent undue political influence. As political scientists have observed for decades, institutions are susceptible to capture in issue areas where the regulatory costs to interest groups are concentrated, certain, or current. While there are companies that appear to support more stringent global regulation of plastics, it's important to underline the economic interest at stake. Significant investments in new infrastructure are being made by fossil fuel and petrochemical companies to increase plastic production, while the use of virgin plastics by many consumer goods companies continues to expand year on year. What we arguably see in the plastics treaty negotiations is that power imbalances have resulted in a privileging of corporate perspectives. Multi-stakeholder dialogues have often been dominated by industry representatives, contributing to a closing down of spaces for other voices. We've also seen an exclusion of rights holders and civil society groups from expert working groups, and indeed from entire negotiating rounds. At the same time, the number of industry representatives has dramatically increased as lobbying efforts have intensified. And in addition to the co-option of spaces by corporate interests, there have been several instances of industry lobbyists pursuing more aggressive strategies to close down debate through intimidation. In a political context where the structural power and agency of the petrochemical and plastics industry give them far-reaching access to officials in governments and international organizations, rights holders and civil society groups depend on formal procedures that ensure their meaningful inclusion. The power dynamics and institutional practices of treaty negotiation have, however, been characterized by inequitable access and participation, in which corporate actors appear to have often exercised or exerted disproportionate influence. An effective and accountable global plastics treaty requires that those affected by a decision have the right, the opportunity, and the capacity to participate meaningfully in deliberations. Prioritizing justice therefore requires attention to issues of procedural justice, ensuring equitable access and sustained participation in decision-making processes. Achieving meaningful inclusion in the Plastics Treaty could start with the incorporation of text on equitable access and participation in environmental decision-making, drawing on precedents in the Aarhus Convention, as has been discussed, in addition to the Escazú Agreement. In addressing corporate capture, there are similarly precedents in international law that explicitly recognize the threat of corporate interests in subverting treaty objectives, most notably the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. A first step towards an accountability framework within the Plastics Treaty would be to distinguish between different types of non-state actor, and building on that, developing a clear definition of conflict of interest that can form the basis of procedures to promote transparency, to promote equity, and to safeguard against undue corporate influence. These forms of procedural justice are crucial if the Global Plastics Treaty is to produce the type of transformational change that is required to tackle the plastics crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. We'll go on right away to the next panelist, Kritika Kanijio, who's a technical legal officer at the Public Health Law and Policy team at the World Health Organization, WHO, which actually does have a very strong framework of engagement with non-state actors to address potential conflict of interest. Kritika, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurent, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. As said by the speakers before me, this webinar is extremely timely with INC 5 right around the corner. At the second INC itself, WHO in its statement had underscored the importance of transparency and management of potential conflicts of interest with public health or environmental objectives in the development and implementation of the Plastics Treaty. As mentioned by Laurent, today I will share information about WHO's policies and processes that are not only vital to our mission, but also to the broader global health landscape. And this is a WHO's framework for engagement with non-state actors, or FENSA, and alongside our conflict of interest policy embedded in a WHO's guideline development handbook. Now, these policies are fundamental to WHO's role as the leading authority on health, which sets norms and standards and provides guidance grounded in rigorous evidence-based research. Ensuring that our decisions remain unbiased is paramount, particularly as we address pressing health issues and provide guidance on topics like sugar substitutes for weight control or the amount of recommended physical activity for adults. And as mentioned by Rob, and I'm hoping Debbie will also talk about it, in the health context, we have observed the interference of commercial and vested interests. Take the tobacco industry, for example, which has operated for years with the express intention of subverting the role of governments and WHO in implementing public health policies. Thus, during the negotiation of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, member states included an express provision to commit to protect tobacco control policies from vested and commercial interests. Thus, WHO has a clear policy of not engaging with the tobacco industry. And FENSA is essentially the backbone of WHO's interaction with non-state actors, an umbrella term for NGOs, private sector entities, philanthropic foundations, and academic institutions. And this was needed because with the explosion of players in the global health sphere, ranging from grassroots NGOs to large-scale corporate foundations, FENSA ensures that each engagement aligns with WHO's mission, it prioritizes public health, and most importantly, maintains WHO's independence and neutrality. And by fostering these collaborative relationships responsibly, FENSA allows WHO to leverage the resources and expertise of non-state actors while upholding principles of transparency, accountability, and trust. Our conflict of interest policies found in both the FENSA and WHO's Guideline Development Handbook are structured to identify, assess, and manage potential conflicts of interest effectively. For the purposes of guideline development, external contributors to WHO guidelines are required to declare interests and submit a CV, which our Secretariat or Steering Committee then assess and determine for the severity of any conflicts. And when conflicts do arise, WHO has a structured management plan. For example, if it is a conflict that is manageable, the expert may be recused from specific discussions. If not, they may be fully excluded from the guideline process. And by clearly disclosing both conflicts and our methods in handling them, WHO not only ensures the credibility of our guidelines, but also strengthens the trust member states place in our recommendations. PENSA itself is a multi-layered framework designed to provide WHO with clear parameters and procedures, emphasizing both the benefits and potential risks of engagement. Benefits like additional resources and expertise are carefully weighed against potential conflicts of interest, particularly when private sector entities are involved. Due diligence and transparency are not just ideas, but concrete processes. And we require each non-state actor to provide comprehensive information on their operations, governance, and sources of funding. WHO then conducts a detailed risk assessment to gauge the alignment between the potential engagement and WHO's mission. In closing, the PENSA and Guideline Development Handbook are more than administrative tools. They are essential pillars that preserve WHO's integrity and allow us to remain a trusted leader in global health. Similarly, just as these systems and processes are essential for advancing public health, they are also crucial for achieving the objectives of the Plastics Treaty. It is imperative that the Plastics Treaty prioritizes public interests over commercial ones, and a robust conflict of interest provision is essential to ensure this priority is maintained. Thank you all for your time, and I hand you back to you, Laura. Thanks.
Thank you, Kritika. This reminded me that I believe at INC1, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in the context of human rights implications or recommendations around the Plastic Treaty, stressed the need to address conflict of interest and proposed as an example Article 5.3 of the FCTC. And so our next speaker, Deborah Tsai, Head of Global Public Health Policy and Strategy at the Global Center for Good Governance and Tobacco Control, will be able to, in detail, present how Article 5.3 works and how it's been used to protect the treaty as well as parties from undue influence from the tobacco industry. Debbie, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you, Laurent. I'll just wait for my slides and check if it's working.
I see the slides, and I see the first slide, the title slide, and it seems to work.
I don't have control, I think. I hope. I don't have control yet. Hold on. I don't have control.
Would it be able for the West web host to move to the next slide?
Let me try again. Okay.
Okay. We see.
I think it's me. Is it me moving it? Hold on. Yeah.
Now we see the Article 5.3 text, and now, okay, perfect. We see the picture.
I think this is it. All right. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'll discuss Article 5.3 guidelines and how this is implemented by parties. It's Article 5.3 is often referred to as this model conflict of interest provision. Actually, it's more than that. It's a treaty obligation. In setting and implementing public health policies, parties shall act to protect these policies from the commercial and vested interests of the tobacco industry. This is based on a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the interests of the tobacco industry and that of public health. We can think about the guidelines as having 8 recommendations divided into 3 parts. One on communication, and another on governance, and a third on regulations. Parties should inform all branches of government about tobacco industry's tactics. To this end, parties actually issue statements, warning letters, and adopt policies in relation to Article 5.3 and industry interference. Parties also recognize that civil society not affiliated with the tobacco industry plays an essential role in monitoring the activities of the industry. Now over to the governance aspects. Public officials should interact with the tobacco industry only to the extent necessary for regulation. Parties actually turn down meetings or publish meetings that are deemed necessary. And some of these are uploaded in their websites. Next, parties must reject partnerships with the tobacco industry. A majority of parties reject tobacco industry's offers to participate. They reject draft instruments and offers of technical assistance from the tobacco industry. Governments should adopt a code for public officials to avoid tobacco industry's gifts and funding. Officials should disclose and diverse interests, disclose current or previous employment. A few parties have adopted some of these rules at the ministry level or across the whole of civil service. According to the Global Tobacco Index, the hiring of former officials remains one of the most popular forms of interference. The FCTC COP prevents interference through a disclosure of interest process. This is a mandatory for observers and the public, as well as the media, and voluntary for governments. The third aspect of the guidelines is about regulation. Parties should require information from the tobacco industry and ensure that it operates in a transparent manner. Publicly accessible information on this is currently consolidated in a global database by the GGTC in collaboration with the Secretariat's Knowledge Hub on Article 5.3. This has allowed us to publish a list of tobacco industry actors that we use for screening. Next, parties should denormalize activities described as socially responsible by the tobacco industry. Currently, over 70 countries have a comprehensive ban on, including on CSR. Parties should not grant incentives, privileges, or benefits to the tobacco industry to run its business and should not invest in the tobacco industry. This means denying it of awards, denying it of benefits in free trade agreements, and removing government funds from the tobacco stocks. Article 5.3 also applies to the negotiations of the COP. According to the rules of procedure, Article 5.3 is applied when granting observer status. Many NGOs have been rejected due to industry links. The rules on meetings shall be implemented in accordance with Article 5.3. So some time ago, I was part of the delegation that voted to have closed meetings because of the tobacco industry's presence. And so it was really shocking to see the tobacco industry at the INCs promoting the recycling of cigarette butts. The tobacco industry should know that safe recycling is not feasible and that any biodegradable substitute would remain hazardous and would undermine the prohibition on making tobacco products attractive under Article 9 of the Convention. There are other provisions in the Plastics Treaty that could conflict with the Convention. Product design incentives are benefits prohibited under Article 5.3. Stakeholder participation goes against rejecting tobacco funding partnerships and participation. Extended producer responsibility could serve as a vehicle for CSR, which should be banned. The COP then noted a similar concern and asked parties to protect tobacco-related environment policies from the interests of the tobacco industry. Engaging with the tobacco industry also conflicts with UN norms. The tobacco business fundamentally conflicts with human rights principles and affects nearly all SDGs. Hence, many UN agencies reject tobacco industry engagement. WHO has even rejected tobacco-funded COVID-19 vaccines. So to foster policy coherence, the future Plastics Treaty must exclude the tobacco industry from stakeholder engagements. It must immediately ban filters. Otherwise, life-saving measures would be undermined. Now, governance and regulatory policies for tobacco exist and should be upheld and explicitly recognized in the future Plastics Treaty. And this could help Article 5.3 establish good precedents for other industries. Thank you. Over to you, Laurent.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for reminding us that the tobacco industry is using environmental policies at country level to undermine, to greenwash their image. And I see that in Spain happening right now where I'm at this moment. And I also want to point out that the FCTC, the Tobacco Treaty, in its preamble, governments are determined to give priority to the right to protect public health, which I thought is important. It also includes an article 4.7, which we're recognizing that the participation of civil society is essential to achieving the objectives of the treaty. which addresses also the issue of making sure that those most affected and are in the plastic treaty, or in this case the tobacco treaty, but that they can participate and they're part of an essential element of the treaty process. Our next speaker is Ana Paula Souda, Human Rights Officer at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Ana Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you, especially for the organizers, for spotlighting such a critical and timely issue. Previous speakers have already highlighted that when the right to science is compromised, individuals and communities may be exposed to harm. Let me rewind. In 1948, after 2 world wars and the Great Depression, world leaders adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 27 declares that everyone has the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. This right has never been more critical and never more in jeopardy. Science has showed us that exposure to harmful chemicals present in plastic materials and products can cause chronic and acute illness and even premature death. And the impact of plastic pollution in developing countries, indigenous peoples, and fancy line communities, and how plastic pollution is exceeding the planetary safe operating space and touching every ecosystem on the planet. However, the right to science is under attack. Corporate influence, attacks on scientific studies, smear campaigns against scientists, misleading literature, and exploitation of scientific illiteracy are tactics used to sow doubt and suppress evidence. These tactics keep the population blind to the consequences of crossing planetary boundaries and unaware of their choices shaped by profit-driven motives. And let's not forget that robust, independent science is also feared by some of those holding power, as it provides the tools to hold polluters to account and provide reparations for people and communities that have long suffered harms of their actions and inactions. This is why we need a plastic treaty that requires states to align policies and programs with the best available scientific science. This also includes protecting indigenous people's rights to their knowledge, practices, and innovations. Government must protect scientific inquiry from conflicts of interest. Governments must also fund research at the level this existential threat deserves. Historic marginalized groups must be included. Knowledge empowers people to exercise their agency and protect the environment. This is powerful. Rio Principle 10 established that access to information, public participation, and access to justice are key pillars of sound environmental governance. Well before Rio, the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights already guaranteed these rights. The rights to access to information, participation, and access to justice are mutually reinforced. Allow me to exemplify. Individuals have the right to information about the known and suspect health and environmental hazards, harms, and risks caused by chemicals used in and released throughout the plastic's life cycle, but there is little transparency about these hazards and risks, so individuals are unable to make informed decisions. The lack of information hampers the right to participate in the development of plastic policies and interferes with their right to effective remedy for the adverse impact they suffer. So how can these rights be translated into the new plastic treaty? Let me start with the right to participation. Meaningful participation is vital throughout the plastic cycle, from production to waste management. Decision-making must involve affected persons and rights holders. The treaty should guarantee free, active, informed participation and establish mechanisms for rights holders to participate and channel their concerns, including at the national level and in periodic assessments of the implementation of the treaty. And please note that I'm referring to rights holders, not stakeholders, which is completely different concept. Regarding access to information, we know that accurate, accessible information on chemicals and waste is crucial for policymaking, monitoring progress, and protecting people. So safeguarding commercially sensitive information at the expense of human health and the planet must be a known goal. The treaty should also allow only chemicals in plastics that have been tested for safety with publicly available toxicity data. It should require transparency mechanisms on the production and release of chemical pollutants. Ensuring full transparency related to health and safety information free from industry interests is essential. The right to access to justice and remedies for people and communities that have suffered harms, including from transboundary impacts, requires holding plastics and chemical producers accountable, supporting environmental remediation, and providing effective remedies for those harmed, including cross-border cases. And in closing, I'd like just to mention that upholding human rights can ensure that environmental policy is driven by facts and evidence, not denialism, greed, and profit. It's an effective means to ensuring environmental decision-making serves the people and protects our planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for those powerful statements about the importance of upholding human rights should be based on facts and evidence, and also distinguish the difference between right holders versus stakeholders, and that difference, that is very, very good point. Our next speaker is Frankie Orona, who's the Executive Director of Society of Native Nations and UNEP Major Groups and Stakeholder Facilitator of Indigenous Peoples and their communities. Frankie, the floor is yours.
Oh, haku, good morning. Hello to each and every one of you. I am honored to share space and join this important conversation on the Plastics Treaty. I'm honored to speak from the perspective of Indigenous peoples and environmental justice communities who have been calling for an ambitious and meaningful action on the plastics crisis. Today, I want to focus on why accountability, transparency, and justice must be the foundation or part of the foundation of this treaty if we are to achieve a truly equitable and effective solution to the plastics crisis. For Indigenous, frontline and fenceline communities, the impacts of plastic pollution are deeply personal as they have been occurring for generations. Our lands, waters, and ways of life have been disproportionately affected by plastic waste that pollutes from extraction to disposal, not from production to disposal, from extraction and the feedstocks to disposal. And you know, it's doing so to the environment, and it erodes our cultures. Our communities are left to face the harshest consequences. It is a human rights crisis. This injustice is not accidental. It reflects centuries of disregard for Indigenous voices, rights, and knowledge systems in environmental policy making in all the decision-making processes. When we discuss the Plastics Treaty, we should not discuss it as a waste management or recycling as solutions, which are very much false narratives about the real problem of plastics. We're talking about justice. This treaty must address the deep-rooted inequities that have allowed marginalized communities to bear the brunt of environmental damage caused by plastic from oil and gas extraction to disposal. Accountability must be a fundamental element of this treaty and foundational. This starts with recognizing who is responsible for the plastics crisis. Large corporations and petrochemical industries are the primary sources of plastic production. However, there needs to be government responsibility as well, as governments allow and perpetuate the industry's harmful behavior, yet they often evade accountability, shifting the burden onto communities and individuals. Indigenous frontline and fenceline voices demand a treaty that holds these companies and governments responsible with clear commitments to reduce plastic production, beginning from extraction to disposal, particularly single-use plastics. Accountability also means enforcing strong, legally binding mechanisms. Voluntary commitments won't be meaningful. We need international standards and legally enforceable action that track, penalize, and ultimately reduce harmful practices. Indigenous communities have long understood that without enforceable commitments, justice will remain for many more generations yet to come. Transparency in decision-making and implementation processes is essential. We need a treaty that empowers Indigenous and frontline communities to participate meaningfully. This includes granting access to data on plastic production, usage, and waste flows. Many communities still struggle to access basic information about toxins they are exposed to and the plastic waste entering their territories. Transparency is also about inclusive representation. Indigenous communities and environmental justice communities have deep knowledge of the ecosystems affected by plastics. Our voices must be heard, not just as a symbolic gesture or a checked box, but as equal partners in designing true, non-toxic solutions. Transparency means involving Indigenous leaders in the treaty negotiation process, respecting our input, and ensuring that all rights holders and stakeholders sit at the decision-making tables. Human rights and environmental justice must be at the core of this treaty. Environmental justice is not only about preventing pollution, but also about repairing the harm done. Environmental justice does not mean to better one community at the expense of another. That is not environmental justice. We advocate for restorative justice measures in the treaty that recognize the rights of Indigenous people, frontline and fenceline communities disproportionately impacted by plastics. This also needs to include financial support for cleanup efforts, healthcare for those exposed to toxic pollution, and reparative programs for Indigenous lands that have been degraded by plastic at all stages, again, from extraction to waste. However, beyond reparations, justice also requires forward-thinking measures that safeguard the rights of Indigenous people and ensure that future generations can thrive without facing the consequences of an unsustainable plastics economy, which can never be a sustainable solution. Justice is preventative as well as reparative. It seeks to create a future where safeguards for human health and environment rights are upheld as human rights. So, in closing, please remember that the Plastic Treaty is not just an environmental document. It is an opportunity to correct a legacy of human health and environmental harm and equity. Indigenous voices are crucial in shaping this treaty because we understand, perhaps better than anyone, the interconnection between people, land, air, and responsibility for the balance of all creation. Our message is clear. A treaty that prioritizes accountability, transparency, and justice will create lasting and meaningful change, not only for the environment, but also for the people who call it home. Our Mother Earth provides all we need in life with unconditional love, no matter how much hurt and pain we cause. Let's return that love to Mother Earth and help put all things back in balance with all creation. So we invite all the participants in this process to join in advocating for a treaty that recognizes the rights and voices and contributions of Indigenous and frontline communities. Again, I thank you to the organizers, and I appreciate and I'm honored to share space to have these very important conversations going into INC 5. Again, thank you. Haku.
Thank you, Frankie, for reminding us that the human rights and environmental justice are at the core of this treaty. And we need to go not only beyond reparation, but also think about the future generations. The next speaker and last speaker, before then we can address and have like a discussion and as many questions and answers addressed through this process. So again, I encourage all of you to start sending us as many questions as possible. Our last speaker now is Rachel Radvani, who's the environmental health campaigner at the Center for International Law and as a Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lauren, and thank you to everyone who is staying on the call and to the previous speakers as well. So as we've heard from everyone who has spoken so far, there are serious issues in the Plastics Treaty with conflicts of interest and with the lack of meaningful public participation. Rights holders such as Indigenous peoples, youth, women, and frontline communities have a right and a moral imperative to participate in these negotiations and push for an ambitious treaty that truly protects their communities and all those who are affected by plastic pollution. And there have been many examples within the treaty space and beyond of the plastics industry's tactics to delay action, and fossil fuel and petrochemical lobbyists have shown up in large numbers to each of the negotiations. As Debbie and Kritika highlighted, the WHO and the FCTC addresses this with the tobacco industry, recognizing that there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the tobacco industry's vested interests and public health policy interests. Similarly, there is a fundamental conflict of interest between certain industries, especially producers of primary plastic polymers and their feedstocks, and the treaty's goals. Plastic production and the plastics themselves are a threat to the environment and human health, and protecting those two things is the goal of the treaty. To end plastic pollution, we must phase down plastic production and the toxic chemicals used in plastics. And industries that are making their profits off of the production and use of plastics and associated chemicals are not going to support a treaty that does those things. As Anastasia detailed, there are many member states negotiating at the INC who have existing legal obligations to uphold the principle of public participation and access to information and access to justice in international forums, including addressing vested interests. However, in the current plastics treaty text, there are few, if any, of these references to protecting these principles. And so from our perspective, there are a few key places where these references should go. One of utmost importance is protecting the science policy interface, or the scientific body, which could review and update annexes within the future obligations, protecting that from conflicts of interest, to ensure that the treaty is informed by independent science. And there are examples from other bodies such as the POPs Review Committee and the Stockholm Convention, and this is an essential element to ensure that the treaty can be updated and adapt with new advancements in scientific research, and that it is informed by, as I said, independent science. And similarly, the means of implementation of the treaty should be protected from vested interests as well, including provisions on information exchange, awareness raising, and education. These should not be influenced by corporate interests. And national plans should be developed in a participatory manner with safeguards against conflict of interest as well. Affiliations of all those registering for these meetings should be publicly disclosed, including the organization the person actually works for, not just who they've registered with. And measures can be taken to further protect against vested interests as the treaty develops. As long as industry representatives representing their company's interests are left free to wander the halls of the negotiations with no vigilance, the negotiations and implementation of the treaty are at high risk. And finally, the treaty must take a human rights-based approach to ensure that these human rights principles are reflected throughout the text. The procedural rights, especially the right to information and participation, offer an opportunity to counter the negative impacts of vested and commercial interests in the implementation of the treaty. Participation should be protected in the rest of the negotiations and in the implementation of the treaty, including in future Conference of the Party or COP meetings, and in any expert group meetings that are set up. So to conclude, the opening up of these spaces to corporate actors has often simultaneously led to the closing down of meaningful inclusion of civil society and rights holders. As we approach the final round of treaty negotiations, it is imperative that member states are able to step up and include these safeguards to protect the treaty from those who seek to undermine it in order to continue profiting off of plastics, and to ensure obligations that ensure meaningful participation from those disproportionately affected by plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I think you gave some very, very specific potential ways of addressing this, but I think we'll probably go more into a discussion on this. So we have about 26 minutes, no, 21 minutes left to this webinar. So we will go straight to the Q&A section of the webinar. So I'll invite all of the presenters and panelists to be ready to join into this into the responses and providing responses. But a lot of the questions seem to be some of the first questions I see here are very much about, well, how do we address the problems we're having, which is one is the participation part, then the conflict of interest element. And as Rachel just pointed out, is that at this stage, there's very little integrated in the treaty process. And there's been some potential discussion and maybe, and a lot of you have stated time after time that the treaty should be based on human rights principles. I mean, priority should be given to human rights, environmental rights, health, and so on and so forth versus commercial interest. Do you think, would your recommendation be at this stage that negotiators should try to do something about this and maybe include in the preamble language and the principles language a statement recognizing that human rights, environmental justice, as our friend from Frankie stated, it has to be based on environmental justice, human rights. Should that principle be stated right in the preamble or top part of the language? And then what could we have in the operative paragraphs to really address the issues of conflicts of interest, stakeholder engagement, as you stated, Rachel, in the areas of means of implementation, information exchange, and national plans. What would be the key recommendations you would make to governments? Who wants to take a shot at that? If you had a magic wand and you could have in the language of the treaty that you think would really address the issue of ensuring that the treaty is forward-thinking and protects future generations from plastic in a way that's human rights based, with environmental principles being at the epicenter.
Maybe I can take a stab at this first. I think if I had a magic wand, we would replicate Article 5.3 for the plastics industry. I think that model and the detail that it goes into on not just in the treaty space, but also on a national level, as Debbie went through in her PowerPoint, is a really good way of providing a firewall and truly protecting against conflicts of interest. It's about registration for meetings in the Conference of the Parties, of course, but it's also about influencing national policies and the national implementation of the treaty, and things like that as well. I think as the text stands right now, there really, as I mentioned, there's not much right in the text right now, and a mention in the preamble is absolutely important because these are things that we need to acknowledge, but at the same time, that doesn't create obligations, and it isn't legally binding. So I think there are a lot of places throughout the text where things like public participation, transparency, and avoiding conflicts of interest should be integrated. And I mean, you could put it in really any part of the text. And I think I mentioned a couple key places that we see that it fits really well, but I think there's a lot of different arguments that could be made about which specific provisions it could go in. But at this point, I think any mention of it is really important to get that conversation started and ensure that in the future COPs, we are able to continue building on that as well.
Do any of the other presenters want to add to this? Kritika, did you see you? No, sorry. Go.
I'm sorry.
Is that you? Go ahead, Frankie.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I would just say I concur and I agree with everything Rachel has just stated. And I would just add to it and say that if I had a magic wand, I would start off with, restricting all industry representatives from attending the INC, first and foremost, because their influence is not in the interest of human health and the environment. And they are the root cause of why we are in this crisis in the first place. And the solutions they propose will continue to be in their self-interest for financial gain over safeguards for human health and the environment. And I would like to state like an example is where they have been very much trying to influence using language and text like sustainable production and sustainable levels. And I would ask, like, what does that look like? What is a sustainable level of cancer in my community? What's a sustainable level of harm that's been perpetuated by industry and government for generations, where the lifespans of our relatives in our communities are losing 5 to 15 years of their lifespan? What does a sustainable level look like, right? There is no such thing. And we need to make sure and ensure that we're not lowering our ambition to that of industry and governments that are not putting out front first the safeguards for human health and environment. I think we need to be realistic and really look at the situation and look at the negotiations and say, first of all, the participation in the INCs have been inequitable. They haven't included the voices of indigenous and frontline communities. They are the experts. They can tell you what has and hasn't worked for generations. They have real solutions that needs to start at the level of those communities that are most disproportionately impacted. Again, not from people in industry and governments that don't come to those communities, don't come and see it and smell it and taste it and hear it and feel it. Those are the people. These negotiations have dehumanized these conversations, and they need to be rehumanized with not stories, but life experiences, true life experiences of those that have been disproportionately impacted for generations. So for me, that the wand would be to remove them from the negotiations, because all they are is a problem, and all they're going to do is continue to push for false solutions, so that we can continue our dependency on oil and gas, petrochemicals and plastics. So I would just add that. Thank you.
And so indeed, the over participation of fossil fuel industry, for example, the media's has raised concerns like the Framework Convention of Climate Change, for example, and over presence of the fossil fuel industry. And even I know there's been some concerns with the plastic treaty negotiations. However, some will argue that some plastics are useful for society, and there's some, and in some cases, there might be a role for those stakeholders. So in that context, and I see that I'm here addressing one of the questions that Ben Schwartz addressed: can industry representatives participate in any way if there's a total exclusion? And I'm wondering what maybe if WHO, if Critica, or if from the Aarhus Convention, is there a way to maybe balance this in the context of some plastic products where you could address that over-representation and that presentation of false solutions that were also presented by our first speakers? Like, we're not going to be able to recycle our way out of this problem, but what would be a balanced way to address that, given that, unlike with the tobacco industry, was very clear that from the very beginning that industry needed to be excluded because there was absolutely no benefit to tobacco products. In this case, obviously, there is some use for plastic products. So how do we balance that?
Thanks, Laurent. And that's a great question, and I think that's sort of what has come up every time Article 5.3 is looked at as a precedent. And I think that's sort of the distinction we have to make, that the industry in this case is a lot more heterogeneous. So I completely agree with what Rachel and Frankie said before me, and we should have some reference in the preamble, perhaps something which sort of states that this treaty should prioritize public health and environmental objectives over commercial interests. It also is important to acknowledge that there is a provision on stakeholder participation, and we perhaps can add some language to that, which allows us to go to the COP and have some guidelines that are robust enough for managing this conflict of interest. And that would be, I think, the most important, because we're also looking at healthcare products and medical products, and how do you sort of engage with the industry in finding suitable alternatives for that. So I think we need to have a holistic approach to this, and something which broadens what already is there in Section 8 of Part 4 is important, but at the same time acknowledging that the broad objective of the treaty is to prioritize public health and environmental objectives. I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, that should be good. Anything from Anastasia? Do you have any?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to, in fact, address the question about exclusion of particular stakeholders. Well, the convention does not specifically address this, but I would like to recall that the Almaty guidelines do call for the development of processes and mechanisms that would avoid the exercise of undue economic and political influence. So while not suggesting specific options, they do provide a basis and a ground for trying to identify what is most effective to the extent it is also compatible with the provisions of the convention. And in terms of suggesting language, perhaps I again go back to the Almaty guidelines, and one provision that I find very important is also the one of ensuring that those constituencies that are particularly affected by these matters should be as much as possible supported in their participation in these forums, so that their views can be taken into account and somehow integrated into the outcomes. And I also saw there was a question about I think it was in the chat about the possibility for public interest observers to attend the meetings, and whether the convention provides specific provisions on that. And I just wanted to clarify that indeed there is a provision on, I was mentioning Article 3, Paragraph 7, which promotes public participation, but then this provision is interpreted through the Almaty guidelines, and the Almaty guidelines make clear that public participation should be ensured to all members of the public, and these should be the right to participate cannot be limited. Therefore, it also extends to subsidiary and expert bodies. So I just wanted to make that clear and respond to the question.
Thanks. But before I go to other questions, I want to give an opportunity if Grant or Rob or Debbie would like to add anything to any of those initial questions.
If I could make just a very brief intervention, I think I would say just to the questions around how you manage conflicts of interest, how you ensure transparent, accountable governance. I think really one of the issues, and thinking more broadly, is that the increasing involvement of business actors in global governance has led to conflicts of interest being somewhat kind of displaced or kind of minimized. So really one of the issues is actually a failure to even acknowledge the existence of conflicts, or that conflicts of interest is something that should be managed. And I think when we look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we see that decades of obstruction from the fossil fuel industry to some extent stem from a lack of a clear definition or even acknowledgement that these conflicts exist. So I think when we speak about specific procedures, there are precedents in international law. I actually think that the kind of first and most important step is simply to acknowledge that there is the potential for diverging interests, and that the objectives of the Plastics Treaty are unlikely to neatly align with those of the petrochemical industry or other companies within the plastics value chain.
Grant, Debbie, or Ana Paula, do you want to add anything to this initial set of questions?
Yeah, I think I'd just echo. I think it was Frankie that said earlier that we should just have a no tolerance policy for these kinds of things, and we can be really copy pasting from a lot of the really great work on tobacco that already exists out there. It doesn't matter that the conflicts of interest aren't tobacco related. It's the same concept, and I think we just need to stop allowing it. A lot of the time in some of these kinds of conferences, you have people stand up and actually shout at industry speakers on stage, and I think that some of that is definitely necessary to normalize the fact that they shouldn't be up there. But I think we really need to be working much more towards policies that would ban people from being on stage or having a voice in these kinds of discussions from the beginning.
Thank you. Debbie, anything to add?
Having heard really wonderful ideas from the panel, I'm thinking the magic wand for me probably would be a shift in terms, as Paula noted, that we should be not talking about stakeholders. We should be talking about rights holders. And I think there should be a shift in the framing. Kritika pointed out that, the challenge here is the heterogeneity of this group of industry actors. And so I think framing it into more of accountability is important. And I also heard this from our speakers. I think it's really important to identify the industry actors and understanding their contribution to the level of pollution, so that we know what level of engagement is required. This idea of liability is really important because it carves out a new role for them. So you change them from stakeholders, producers, or even responsible producers into a polluter who must just change. They must change their ways. They must pay. And then it will make more sense eventually to make sure they don't have a seat at the table. They're not partners. And I didn't get to mention this earlier, but in the FCTC, there's also a provision on liability that's really missing here. So in Article 19 of the FCTC talks about parties dealing with the liability of the tobacco industry, including compensation. So that means parties should make the tobacco industry pay for the cleanup of the cigarette butts. And that's related to a question that I saw in the chat box. It's really the industry that must pay. Estimates have shown that there's about 20 billion in marine ecosystem losses every year because of the cigarette butts. Parties really have to charge this in the form of taxes, in the form of surcharges, definitely not EPR, definitely not by allowing the tobacco industry to be part of the solution, definitely not in terms of campaigns like Keep America Beautiful, because these would really just undermine the FCTC. So I guess that's sort of part of the magic wand, so to speak. Thank you, Laurent.
Thank you, Debbie. And just you bring up a very good point, and it was mentioned, I think, by Ana Paula and Frankie, the concept of reparation and mechanisms for reparation to be included in the treaty process. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we don't have no time for more questions. So I'm going to just summarize very quickly. We've had some very interesting points. Grant Ennis presented the cross-industry playbook and presenting the 9 frames that are often used, from denial, post-denial, normalization, zero solution, the boomerang, the magic frame, treatment, the victim, the elements of victim blaming, the knotted web of solutions, and basically, but you pointed out, Grant, that basically we need policy solutions, population-based interventions. We cannot focus on the individuals. Anastasia, you mentioned all the key elements of the Aarhus Convention: access to information, participation, action to justice. The key elements of Almighty also avoiding undue economic influence, which is and minimizing inequalities. Including clear transparency policies and review procedures, also ensuring that there's a good review mechanism for the treaty. And you then also remind us that in addition to Aarhus Convention, the Esquizú agreements has similar measures. Rob Roston, you addressed all the issues about corporate capture and the concerns about the strong economic interest and conflicts associated with the plastic treaty problem, with the power imbalances also in terms of representation and increased industry representation and not adequate representation or participation of stakeholders. And so the need to use precedents from other treaties to address those problems of corporate capture. Kritika, you remind us of the strong framework of engagement with non-state actors, which applies to all civil society. So it's not only corporations, but civil society, NGOs, media and academia, and philanthropic partners, and how this is absolutely critical to see the benefits and risks of any engagement. Debbie, you gave a very good explanation of how Article 5.3 works and the fact that it is actually a legally binding article in the FCTC, and reminded us also of the strong use of environmental measures by the tobacco industry at country level and the EPR problem with used as greenwashing. Ana Paula, the right to science being under attack. You stated the need to hold polluters accountable and the concept of reparation, which was also then seconded by others. The need for remedies and you pointed out to the big difference between right holders versus stakeholders. Something which is absolutely critical. And the fact also that the treaty needs to be based on evidence-based, tested, publicly available data, and we need to include rights and remedies in the process. Frank, the transparency issue problems with should be a basis for this treaty. You remind us that the lands and water of indigenous people are unproportionately affected by plastics. You remind us also that we will not recycle our way out of this problem. The plastic epidemic. We need enforceable measures, transparency, and accountability, and human rights and environmental justice should be at the core of the treaty, something which is absolutely critical. And we need to go beyond just reparation also and look at the future of the treaty. And Rachel, you stated that obviously that there's serious issues of conflict of interest that need to be addressed, and areas of transparency, and ensure the meaningful participation of right holders, and protect the and you provided some very key examples of how it could be introduced during the intervention, and then the response to the questions to protect science policy, for example, in the areas of means of implementation, information exchange, national plans, and so on and so forth. So thank you all for those great presentations and input. We're unfortunately coming to the end, so we'll give back the floor to Diana, who will then finish up the event. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Thank you very much for your great moderation. Thank you to all the speakers. I just wanted here, and to all those who have joined us today, and those who will later watch the video of this event, I just wanted to bring to attention a few more dialogues that are coming up. And the next one in this Road to Busan is indeed already taking place tomorrow at the same time of the event of today. Tomorrow we will be launching and discussing an initiative of Greenpeace, Break Free from Plastic and Plastic Pollution Coalition, the Champions of Change, Business Leaders for Plastic Production Reduction. It's a global initiative that is giving companies a platform to leverage their influence and push for a stronger global plastics treaty that will drastically, hopefully, cut plastic production. And I just wanted to bring to your attention that more than 350 businesses have already signed an open letter under this initiative. We have a few more events coming up, as you will see in this slide. Next week, we have 2 more sessions in this Road to Busan dialogue series, and a few more coming up the weeks after. We have also other events that could be of interest for this community, so I encourage you to visit our website and have a look at the other resources. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this event, and that this was also shared in the chat, you can share the video of this event with your friends and colleagues who were not able to join us today, as the video is already available on the webpage of the event. You will find there also some links, the presentations, as we saw that some of you have been already asking for the slides. And also you will find there in a few days a summary of the key points that were mentioned during this event. So a warm thanks to all who have joined us today, and see you soon online.